This corporate reform narrative, which is now the status quo in education in this country, rests on the claim that our schools were great 50 years ago, but they've fallen into decline. Well, they don't know their history. Three big changes occurred in these past 50 years. First, the courts and the federal government ended legally mandated racial segregation. Our society is still dealing with the consequences of generations of discrimination and poverty and subjection. African American families continue to suffer from the legacy of segregation and the lack of economic opportunity over many years. Second, our society ended the practice of excluding children with disabilities from public education. It's been very expensive to do, but we've done this. When reformers complain about rising costs, they apparently do not know that special education has been the single biggest recipient of new funding. When Congress passed the legislation for special education, it pledged to pay 40% of the cost. It has never fulfilled that promise. And third, because of changes in federal law, our society has experienced an enormous wave of immigration from non-English speaking countries. Many of our schools now have significant numbers of children who cannot speak or read English. So 50 years ago, many of our schools were racially segregated, had few if any students with disabilities, and very few non-English speaking children. Our students have to deal with the challenges they have now and not pine for a time when such challenges were ignored. As far as progress goes, we have only one national measure, and that is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's a federal testing program that I described before. It's been operating since the 1970s. Well, contrary to the reform narrative, there has been substantial academic progress made over these past 40 years in which it's been administered. Achievement has not declined. In fact, black students made the greatest gains, especially in the 1970s and 1980s. No one can say exactly why. It may have been because of desegregation. It may have been because of smaller class sizes. It may have been because of the added resources of federal programs like Title I and a variety of other federal programs. Maybe it was greater economic opportunities for black families. It could have been all of the above or other things. The black-white achievement gap that existed in the 1970s was dramatically reduced. In some grades and some subjects, it was cut in half. To make new progress, we may need to do more of what we were doing in the 1970s and 1980s, because the achievement gap has stalled since then in terms of change. Don't believe anyone that says that achievement has not improved in North Carolina. In 1992, only 15% of the fourth graders in this state scored at the basic level in math on federal tests. By 2003, the proportion had grown from 50% to 85%. That's huge. Phenomenal. However, since the implementation of No Child Left Behind, the rate of improvement has stalled. It's gone from 85% to 87%. No more phenomenal gains. Only a 2-point difference. Similarly, the proportion who reach proficient on the federal test, which is equivalent to an A, it's a solid A, soared from 13% in 1992 to 41% in 2003. This is dramatic, 13% to 41%, getting an A on this tough federal exam. But again, the growth in the state scores has stalled. There's been very little change from 2003 to 2009. It went from 41% to 43%. The same pattern is found in 8th grade math, where again there was the proportion scoring at basic soared from 1990 to 2003, and it's barely changed since then. As in reading as well, there have been no gains in either grade since the implementation of NCLB in 2003. Well, what about those terrible international test scores? Isn't it just awful that our students rank in the middle? Why shouldn't we be number one? When the latest international scores were released last December, the PISA exam, Secretary Arnie Duncan reacted with alarm. He said it was a wake-up call to the nation. President Obama said it was our generation's Sputnik moment. But here's what you need to know. The first international test was given in the mid-1960s, and our students ranked 12th out of 12. We were at the very bottom. We're making progress. We're in the middle now. Over the past half century, these international tests have been given again and again, and we have usually ranked either at the middle or the bottom quartile. We have never been at the top. In his 2011 State of the Union address, President Obama said, and I quote, "We should not listen to the naysayers because our nation has the world's greatest economy, the most productive workers, the most inventors, the most patents, the most dynamic businesses, and the best colleges and universities in the world." Now, there's a very prominent professor at the University of Oregon, Professor Yang Zhao, born and educated in China, who's one of the most eminent critics of this testing regime. And Professor Yang Zhao said, "How could a generation that ranked in the bottom quartile on the international test produce all these wonderful achievements? It doesn't make any sense." Well, I'm old enough to remember the real Sputnik in 1957, when the Soviet Union launched the first space satellite. The media said that we were doomed. It was all the fault of our lousy schools. They said the Soviets would beat us because their science and mathematics education was better than ours. But guess what? They're gone and we're still here. Why? Because we believe in freedom and opportunity, in individual creativity and in ingenuity, not in compliance and five-year plans. We certainly need to improve our math and science programs. But maybe those international tests are not good predictors of the future.